In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
This is the third interview we've done about the quest for perpetual economic growth and the damage it causes. I've also interviewed Julia Steinberger and Brian Check of CASE, the Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. I'll put the links below to those interviews. And today I'm talking with Mark Burton of Steady State Manchester. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Dave.
I've read some of the stuff your organisation puts out, and it's really impressive and very, very interesting. Before we talk about what you're up to, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's your motivation?
Okay, it's a good question. Always good one to focus on just why we're here, why we do what we do. I guess the problem is the dominance of the economic growth model. And our own particular focus is on the sub-regional level, the level of the city region, or as we sometimes like to talk about, the bioregion, because in a way the sort of administrative boundaries are quite sort of arbitrary. So that kind of level of scale, we're talking about a population of about 3 million, and we began looking at a more local level, that's a municipal level, but particularly given the government's devolution changes in the last decade, it made sense for us to kind of focus much more on the kind of Greater Manchester level. Okay. But it's dominance of economic growth in determining and shaping policy and the dependence on it.
And why is that a problem?
Why is it a problem? Because it is unsustainable, because we know that economic growth ecologically it causes damage, because in a way, if we get behind the label economic growth and look at actually what's really going on, we're looking at the continual expansion of the use of energy, the use of materials, and their jettisoning in the case of the byproducts of energy, sort of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but also other pollutants, of course, increasing in their kind of the problem that they pose. So that's basically it. But then also we are highly skeptical of the social and economic benefits of economic growth, because we see it as creating and feeding in to increase inequality, increase division. So it doesn't even deliver what it is supposed to deliver, as far as we can see.
Yeah, so just to be devil's advocate, I mean, you know that I'm completely on your side on this, but just to be devil's advocate, can't you decouple GDP growth from those things?
Yeah, and the short answer is there's no evidence that can be done. I think the longer answer is to say that, yes, there can be some relative decoupling. So the intensity of the economy per unit, if you like, per pound of economic activity, the amount of energy used, the amount of materials used, has decreased over time. Essentially, the economy has got more efficient in its use of inputs.
Yeah.
But because it continues to expand, those increases of inefficiency don't keep up with the rate of expansion. So when we talk about absolute decoupling, there is no evidence that takes place or has taken place, except in a few economies on greenhouse gas emissions, but nowhere near the rate at which is required for climate mitigation.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it also the case that if a country's GDP goes up, then that country will consume more, but Western countries don't produce very much anymore. So they're consuming things which are produced on the other side of the world, and it just doesn't go towards their the figures of their contribution to climate change and ecological destruction, does it? That's China's problem or Indonesia's problem, but not ours. But we are consuming it.
Yes, and of course our government kind of always cites the kind of the local territorial figures for reduction in in greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But actually, yes, it leaves aside both the kind of the embodied materials and energy that come in through our imports, but also it leaves aside sectors like international shipping and aviation, which
that's what I wanted to ask you. Is international shipping definitely isn't included in a country's GDP figures?
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's really,
or at least in its greenhouse gas data.
right. Okay.
It's a separate category. If you look at the kind of international carbon budget sort of data sets and so on, it's a separate category.
So if you add up all the carbon emissions for all the countries in the world, it doesn't equal the total global carbon emissions.
No, you'd have to add in what they call bunkers, which is the kind of the fuel used by those two sectors. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Western countries can say, look, we are decoupling GDP growth from all these kind of emissions, but what they're actually doing is exporting those emissions.
Yes, and then the other point is that the GDP figures themselves are inflated, essentially through the expropriation of value from those productive economies in the global south. And I've been saying this for a number of years based on the work of people like John Smith, but also and some of the kind of writers like Samir Amin in the 70s or onwards have kind of pointed that out. But also there's been a really interesting article just came out in the last week from Jason Hickel and colleagues, which has quantified the amount of labor that is coming into the rich countries, the amount of labor, the amount of materials, the amount of energy, that essentially is an unequal transfer that those countries benefit from. Yeah. And it's enormous, it's bigger even than we thought.
Yeah. So tell us about your organization. What are you doing? How did you start? What successes have you had? Is it,
Well, we started 10 years ago, and there've been some kind of prior work. A number of us have been involved in climate activism at a local level, and we identified that although the city of Manchester in this instance had it was very early putting together a climate action plan, and it had some good ambitions in terms of the emissions it was going to save, but we recognized that there was a problem in terms of the contradiction between those ambitions and the adherence to boosting economic growth at the municipal and regional level. And also then there were sectors that were never talked about, like the airport. And of course, we've got a huge international airport in Manchester as well, which is responsible for huge numbers of emissions. All these, of course, after the pandemic, it's gone down quite a bit, but yeah. So we basically kept saying that. And then we kind of realized that, well, actually, we need to do a bit more homework on this so that we've got some really robust kind of arguments and also some alternatives to present, so that it wasn't just about sort of criticizing the model, but sort of saying you could do things differently. And then that also led to a kind of a question that really needed to be answered, which was, but we live in a global economy, in a global system. So can you have a steady state economy in one city, in one region? To what extent can you do that? To what extent are you unable to do that because of the interconnections and dependency on the global economy and on the national economy and so on? And essentially what we then did was began to say, well, yeah, that's a fair point, and you can't do everything. And it would be silly to pretend that you can kind of really change the overall reality by local action. However, there are things that can be done because there is scope for manoeuvre in certain areas. So we began to focus on areas like local finance and the use of local finance. We began to look at things like food and food production. We began to look at things like the kind of some of the more kind of economic and social dimensions of it, like pay inequality and so on.
And you can educate people and raise awareness.
Of course, yes.
Further afield than Manchester.
Yes.
So how are you funded, by the way?
We run on a shoestring. We're funded entirely by subscriptions and donations from supporters and members.
So you're looking for supporters and members?
Yeah, and that's all we need, because
this gets you a few.
Yeah, essentially it's voluntary activity. A number of us are retired. Others, have other roles and do it part-time. And we were very keen that we kind of had, I suppose, a very sort of lean model for what we were doing, and therefore we didn't get involved in pursuing grants and then having to administer them and so on, which in a way is often a distraction from the activity that you're really trying to focus on. So for our purposes, that model is sufficient. Yeah.
So our position at Low Impact is that there are two big killers in the economy. Wealth concentration kills democracy, and GDP growth kills nature. And the way I explain it is that GDP growth increases spending power. And when spending power goes up, people will buy more stuff. And there's no way to ring fence that extra spending so that it's not spent on material things, cars and second homes and electrical goods and clothes and flights and so on. And it is spent on those things, which is why the countries with the high GDP consume more material things than countries with low GDP, and why global material resource extraction is constantly growing, and so is ecological destruction. And so what's your take on that, and what's the best way you've found to explain it?
Yeah, well, I agree. Although there is the question of the who, because we know that spending power isn't equally distributed by any means.
That as well, yeah.
And the kind of the phrase, or the kind of almost like the slogan that I rather like, is that a rising tide doesn't lift all boats, and it sinks some boats. So just because the economy is expanding doesn't mean that everybody benefits. And through things like investment, you actually displace people from jobs and so on. Because often investment goes into technology and so on. So it's by no means an unalloyed sort of benefit, even in its own terms. So yes, I kind of agree with your analysis broadly.
But my analysis doesn't work for a lot of people. They have a narrative about the way the world works, and there's it just pings off. So have you found a way to get through that?
I'm not sure. I think, again, focus on the consequences. So we focus on the kind of the unequal consequences of aggregate economic growth. We focus on the ecological consequences, the consequences for the planetary systems, and so on, and essentially say, present the evidence that, as we were saying before, that it cannot be decoupled, or if it can, not at anything like the rate that's required.
I guess it's hard, isn't it? Because growth does bring benefits. I mean, infrastructure, healthcare, welfare state, people's lives get better in obvious ways. Yeah. But after a certain size, the problems begin to outweigh the advantages. But it's not so obvious to people, and I don't know how to get past that. It's a lot of people don't respond that well to evidence. Really, it's they have a narrative, and evidence doesn't really change people's narratives. Usually, it needs a new story about the way the world works.
Yes, because I think that notion of we need economic growth, and economic growth brings benefits, it shapes so much of the kind of the discourse, of policy, of the way in which we understand and talk about things, and that is something that is pervasive in the media and so on.
Absolutely, it's on radio all the time.
So that is difficult to combat, because in a way you're saying the kind of the rather bizarre and off the wall things. Although what's interesting, I think, since we've been doing this work, is that I don't say we've changed the model in any way, but I think we're getting much more of a hearing than perhaps
Really?
when we started, and not just for the kind of the central message, but for some of the the ideas that we were talking about over that time, over the period.
Yeah, Brian Check at Casse said that he's got the ear of politicians now, where he never used to have. People are actually starting to listen, because climate change is there's no debate about climate change anymore. Not a serious debate, and so they're starting to sit up and take notice, and nothing we seem to do seems to work in a constantly growing economy. And I think some people are waking up to that now. What was the light bulb moment for you? I remember I read something by Herman Daly years ago, and I thought, God, that makes sense. And then I started to read more, and it became obvious.
Yeah, well, I go back a very long time, back to the early 70s when I was a student, and we started what we called an eco-action group at our college, and that was around about the time that Friends of the Earth was starting up in this country, and also some of the other kind of movements, and almost like that first phase of a broad environmental movement. But at that time, the Limits to Growth publication came out, and also work by people like Barry Commoner and so on. And also economists were also asking the question in its own terms about economic growth. So I've got a book from that period called The Diseconomics of Growth, which is interesting. It wasn't really talking about the environment, but it was talking about the policy failures of economic growth. So that was quite interesting. So I've kind of always had this belief, really, since I was a young man, and I mean, maybe I was kind of primed for that, because I suppose I adopted kind of left-wing and socialist outlook pretty early on. But that was kind of always a kind of, I suppose it was more sort of William Morris than Lenin, if you like.
Yes,
in terms of a kind of a protest against commodification and the ugliness of the modern world.
The socialist governments don't have a better record than capitalist governments, do they? Really, the so-called socialist governments,
with some exceptions, yeah.
What about terminology? Degrowth versus post-growth versus steady state. Obviously, you favour steady state. It's in the name of your organisation.
Well, yes, because 10 years ago, degrowth, I mean, we were aware of the concept, but it didn't have very much currency. So we adopted steady state economy at that stage, steady state. Maybe if we'd been a couple of years later, we might have gone for degrowth. I don't really know. Basically, we use all those terms, depending on what we're saying and who we're saying it to. I see myself very much as part of the degrowth movement. I'm involved in some of the work. We had a recent international conference organised from Manchester, which was both a conference of the degrowth networks, research and degrowth networks, and also the International Society for Ecological Economics. So those kind of elements come together. We'll also use post-growth. So we last year we did what we called a post-growth award, or post-growth challenge rather, which was really about the kind of trying to find better ways to communicate this message. But we have our own concept, which we call the viable economy and society.
I saw that,
and we use that partly because it's a positive. We found that early on we were talking about the problem of economic growth, but that kind of was very negative. And okay, so it's fine to be negative, to say what you're against, and to criticize the dominant model, but we also needed to have something that was kind of more positive. Now, I don't really know if viable economy and society works. We think it has a certain kind of attractiveness, but it hasn't become current in any way. But yeah, we do use that as almost like the sort of the flip side of those three terms that you mentioned: steady state, degrowth, post-growth. They have slightly different meanings, but they overlap and connect, don't they?
Yeah, I think I have a slight problem with degrowth. I think David Fleming said it's better not to focus on degrowing the current economy, but in growing the new economy to replace it. And I think that's the problem with me. It's like you're trying to continue with capitalism, but to take the growth out, which I'm not sure is possible at all. I think capitalism is absolutely based on perpetual growth. And so post-growth seems to indicate to me a different system past the sort of the current system we've got, whether you call it capitalism or some sort of corrupt corporate nonsense, whatever you want to call it. And then it will be steady state, slightly fluctuating like this, but not like this. And so that's the problem.
Of course, there are contested meanings of the term degrowth. So, someone like Dan O'Neill at University of Leeds did I think a helpful kind of piece of work where basically he said that we need to degrow the economy down to a level at which it can be maintained as a steady state. And then that would be a post-growth economy as well.
But degrow capitalism? Degrow this economy?
I don't think he really answered that question. I would certainly say that a sustainable economy, a sustainable society is incompatible with capitalism. And probably most people in the degrowth movement are anti-capitalist. But some, I think, don't really follow that through very consistently and clearly.
No.
But then the other idea that is there in the kind of the degrowth circles is that basically the word degrowth is saying let's focus away from growth. So let's change the conversation. Let's not focus on that dimension at all. So that's helpful up to a point, but I think it can potentially fudge the question that our economies are much too large materially. We can't go on consuming and using resources and energy at the levels at which we do. So
Western economies, certainly,
and that, of course, is a huge challenge because that does mean taking things away. It means a kind of a frugality that would have to be managed in a very sensitive and careful way. Otherwise, many people would suffer. So it's a real challenge, and I wouldn't at all pretend I had the answers to that.
No, and I think the problem when you start talking about replacing capitalism or to start talking about anti-capitalism, for a lot of people that means only state socialism, the Soviet system. They can't think of anything else at all. We've had this so many times. We'll have comments. Oh, so you're a Stalinist then, or something like that. And it's like, no. Can you not? Have you no imagination? Can you not imagine a decentralized, mutually owned economy that hasn't got the growth imperative? And there's an argument also I've heard so many times. We need to grow the economy to generate the money to solve the problems via constantly growing economy. You're only going to solve some of the problems, but meanwhile the growing economy is going to cause loads more, which then you'll need to solve with more money and so on. It's a bit like, actually it's exactly like trying to put out a fire with petrol.
Yes, and this is why certainly we have some differences from the Green New Deal kind of idea, which is very attractive. I have to say that the idea that in one package you can put together climate mitigation, dealing with the energy crisis, social and economic justice, and that it's almost like a package you can take off the shelf in some form. There's a great attractiveness to that, and I think we really struggle, those of us that believe in the degrowth steady state type alternative, to convey our ideas in a way that has that kind of attractiveness. But the problem with the Green New Deal is it's based on the Keynesian model, which basically is about increasing demand, increasing the government investment and so on, in order to, you create jobs, you create incomes, but you create multipliers in the economy. The problem is the multiplier is not selective. So you have, unless you have a number of parallel policies like caps on total resource use, caps on total energy use, equity in terms of who uses what energy and materials and so on, built in a progressive kind of way, then it will simply kind of increase the amount of material and energy flows in the economy and into the economy.
I'm not sure how you would get governments to introduce policies like that. I mean, they're incentivized in very, very different ways, aren't they?
This is the problem, yes. Yeah.
I saw your article. I just saw it this morning, actually, on monetary reform and growth, based on Positive Money's ideas. I haven't had time to read it yet, but I skimmed it. It looks really, really interesting. So I'd like to talk with you more about this, not in this interview, later, but I do think the starting point is money. And I watched a video by Richard Werner the other day. He's one of my heroes. He actually empirically proved that almost all money is created by banks when they make loans. And he's always been a hero of mine. But during that interview, he said, we don't have to worry about growth. Growth isn't the problem. We can have infinite economic growth. I'm like, oh, Richard, what are you saying? What are you saying? So that was, but I do think the starting point is money. And for me, if the exchange medium can't be accumulated, and if it's issued with no interest, then people just get rewarded for the work that they do, not for having money. And I think that stops the constant push for growth. Like, it removes the growth imperative. And I'm working with a group promoting mutual credit for exchange and something called use credit obligations for savings and investment. And Sean Fensom in Manchester, who you know, he's been working with us, and I'd love to talk with you more about that. But as I say, not in this interview, maybe in a future one, or just just in private, and we can have a conversation about that. Because now you have a lot of allies listed on your website. You can certainly add us to that, and I can put you in our directory, and I can add your books and publications.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah.
But I'd love to talk to you again, because I love what you're doing and I love the things that you put out. But I think that'll probably do for today. And
okay, well, maybe money is one to talk about. Certainly, I'm a skeptic in terms of monetary reform.
I skimmed, but I saw.
Yeah, I don't think it gets to the fundamentals, although clearly it is a support for the kind of expansionist economy that we have. So I don't rule it out, but I think there's a real danger of putting all our eggs into the basket of monetary reform, as if that will somehow solve the problem, when that's not ultimately where the problem lies, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe you had a look at what kind of the critique I've put out.
We'll read that article.
Take a look, and we'll maybe have a debate on that. Yeah.
Yes. I'll put a link to that article below the video and in the blog, and I'd love to talk to you more about that, because I think mutual credit and use credit obligations do remove the growth imperative, but yeah, we can talk later.
Yes, and I think you can do a lot of things in that area, so I don't kind of rule it out and so on. We are kind of actively interested in that stuff. Yeah.
I guess I think trying to get policy changes, I just see that as banging your head against a brick wall, really.
Yes.
I don't see any acceptance of it at the higher level. But okay, so Mark, it's been lovely speaking with you. And we'll arrange another chat to talk about money.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks very much, and nice to meet up at last, and have the chat. Yeah.
Cheers, Mark.